House Financial Services Chairman Barney Frank wants a complete audit of the Federal Reserve. CNBC's Hampton Pearson has the full report. Hello, Hampton.
Good evening, Larry. House Financial Services Chairman Barney Frank sees audits and lending curbs in the Fed's future. Half the House members have signed on as co-sponsors of a bill to allow the GAO to audit Fed interest rate decisions. Curbs on Fed lending authority may also be coming. In an exclusive interview with CNBC's Steve Leisman, New York Fed President Bill Dudley says oversight, yes, but not at the expense of monetary policy independence.
If it starts to do that, then how are the financial market participants going to react? They're not going to be too happy about that. Interest rates are going to rise, and that's going to be bad for the economy.
There's nothing in writing yet, but negotiations continue. Democrats hope to approve a regulatory reform plan in October. Larry, back to you.
All right, thanks very much, Hampton. Now, big story, front page of today's New York Times. Taxpayers are starting to see some cold cash from banks that are repaying their government bailout money. But a huge chunk of this TARP money may never be repaid. So let's debate. Was TARP a winner or a loser for American taxpayers and the economy? Here to square off, CNBC contributor and syndicated columnist Jerry Bowyer and CNBC contributor Tony Fratto, former White House Deputy Press Secretary. Let's just put some numbers on the board. First of all, let's do the TARP paid. This is the capital purchase. There is some good payments going on. You can see between paying down the loans and the stock warrants, Amex, 23% return to the taxpayers, Goldman Sachs, 20%, Morgan Stanley, Northern Trust, Bank of New York Mellon, and so forth. On the other hand, to be balanced and fair, let's look at some TARP unpaid numbers. AIG, $70 billion. Fannie and Freddie, close to $100 billion. Mortgage foreclosure modification relief, $50 billion. GM and Chrysler, $80 billion. And it looks to me like there may be another couple of $100 billion in that parcel. So, all right, Tony Fratto, right now, you are in the Bush administration with President Bush and Treasury man Paulson when the TARP policy was made. Are you ready to crow about success, or will you acknowledge that there are still some unanswered sums?
There's still some unanswered questions, Larry, but there's absolutely no question of the success of the TARP program. If you take you back to a year ago, in September of 2008, and it was, stuff out of the book of Revelations. We had, banks failing, we had the money market freezing up, we had credit frozen. This was really bad, and the future of the U.S. economy was at stake. And, every dime that went into TARP, in the core of the TARP program, the capital injection program, and some of the Fed programs to inject liquidity, unquestionably saved the financial system, and that was good for the country. Go ahead, Larry.
I'm just going to say, Jerry Bowyer, Tony is really dwelling, and I think the best part, and one has to give Treasury man Henry Paulson some credit, the so-called capital purchase plan, which looks to be repaid. We don't know yet. Citi is still outstanding, Bank of America, a lot of banks. But the early returns are good. But, Jerry, TARP was writ large from the end of Bush through the early Obama. And suddenly we were guaranteeing, with huge taxpayer sums, automobile companies, for example.
Right.
And then adding on to Fannie and Freddie. I mean, Fannie and Freddie alone, $100 billion, Jerry. Is that ever going to be paid back?
No, and neither is the auto money. And the bank money will be paid back, which means that TARP wasn't necessary in the first place, that mark-to-market accounting really was distorting the market, and that it wasn't needed. Look, Tony says it looks like something from the book of Revelations. I think it's more from Genesis. It is the original sin of our crisis was TARP. Because if you don't have TARP, then you don't have the bank bailout, you don't have the auto bailout, you don't have the bank nationalizations, you don't have the auto nationalizations, you don't have the PAYSAR,
That's right, because
you don't have the cars. And you probably don't even have the stimulus. You probably don't even have the stimulus bill, because the stimulus bill was sold as, Wall Street got theirs. Now Main Street's supposed to get theirs. So TARP was the original sin.
Tony, your response?
Yeah, Jerry, I had this same conversation with our good friend John Taylor on it, where John puts the the onus on TARP for actually creating the financial crisis. I think it's just wrong. You know, you look at what happened to Lehman Brothers. That had nothing to do with TARP, and we saw the carnage that took place.
Yeah, it had to do with mark-to-market accounting.
It wasn't mark-to-market accounting.
The Lehman write-down was a FASB 157 write-down. You guys missed the point, Tony. It wasn't $1 trillion thrown at the banks. It was mark-to-market. Mark-to-market comes into effect in November of 2007.
But the fact of the matter is that there were huge capital holes there, and you can't hide them. And mark-to-market,
and where did the capital holes come from?
Count mark-to-market doesn't hide the fact that you have huge capital holes in the bank.
Mark-to-market created the huge capital holes because it forced write-downs where there wasn't really a need for write-downs, which is why when you implemented mark-to-market, that was right at the top of the market, and the bottom was in April when they suspended mark-to-market.
And let me ask you, Tony, something that still troubles me. I think that most, if not all, the bank money is going to be paid down. I don't know about AIG. I don't know about that, okay? But here's what I think I do know, and I want to ask you because I think the precedent is very, very bad. The government owns Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The government is going to own that forever. That is a bottomless pit. And whatever money we make back from the banks repaying the taxpayers, we are going to lose it on Fannie and Freddie, are we not?
I am not going to disagree with you on that, Larry. That's why we tried to reform Fannie and Freddie for 8 years and were rebuffed by the Congress. Look, the taxpayers were always going to be on the hook for the disaster that was Fannie and Freddie and the implicit government guarantee. It was going to happen either sooner or later.
GM didn't have an implicit government guarantee. Why do we have to be on the hook for General Motors and Chrysler?
Look, I don't want to be on the hook for General Motors either. That was a political decision, and I don't even that was not part of the financial rescue. I know that TARP was used as a piggy bank, but Congress would have found that piggy bank one way or the other because it was a political decision. It was convenient that the TARP money was there, but Congress was not going to.
Well, that's what happens when you create a piggy bank with $700 billion in it. Guess what? Congress is going to raid it.
Think about this, Tony. If you don't get the Fannie Freddie back and the well deepens, I mean, it's $100 billion. It could wind up being $200 billion.
Well,
you
that's
know
true.
that. You're an expert on that.
That's right.
If Jerry is right about General Motors and Chrysler, and Lord knows what else, at the end of the day, the banks may repay the taxpayers a couple of $100 billion with interest from the warrants. That's cool, but the taxpayers may wind up on the short end of the stick for $400, $500, $600 billion. And that's not a very good deal. And then on top of that, you got the enhanced government control of the economy setting a bad precedent.
And the trashing of the Republican brand.
Yeah, look, I do think it is an awful precedent, but it's the thing you have to do when you're in a crisis. There's no other way to deal with it when your house is burning down. On AIG and Fannie and Freddie, on GM, look, I'm right with you. I mean, but those costs were going to come one way or the other. I will say this, in the case of AIG was so intertwined in the U.S. economy and the global economy, if the taxpayer never gets another dime back, it was still better than the alternative of letting AIG fail.
You know, Jerry Bowyer, let us not assume that Citibank's going to do it. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Citibank may pay it back, they may not. There's still some outstandings. Jerry, at the end of the day, what's the biggest thing that you worry about on this whole TARP venture?
The biggest thing I worry about is that it's trashed the Republican brand for years to come, and the free market, conservative, supply-side brand getting blamed for something the government did.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Happy birthday, by the way, Jerry Bowyer. We're not even going to name a number.
47.
Tony, 47. Look at him. He doesn't look a day over 35. Tony Fratto, you don't look a day over 35. You're very kind to come on. I don't know, man. I've never been a big fan of TARP, and I'm still not a fan of TARP. Thank you for helping us. Meanwhile, folks, stocks hold the high ground for August, up over 3%. We're going to take you inside the month's market action. Plus, we're going to talk to prominent investor. Heck, I call him famed investor, Dougie Cass. He called the March bottom, and now he is calling a market top. You do not want to miss this. Stay with the Kudlow Report. We're coming right back.